Hey everyone, welcome to Logan's Smosh Pit. Glad to have you here. Do me a favor and please subscribe if you haven't already. Yes indeed, time for another rock and read. Today we will read chapter 4 of My Effin Life by Geddy Lee. I've never done this before, but I decided to skip a chapter. The reason being that chapter 3 is extremely graphic. Geddy describes the absolutely atrocious, despicable, and vile things that his family endured at the hands of the Germans during the Holocaust. Simply reading about it in my head brought tears to my eyes and made me feel sick to my stomach. So there's no way that I can maintain my composure enough to read it out loud. I'm sorry, and I hope that you guys will forgive me. Anyway, chapter 4 is called Bass is in My Blood. Let's check it out. Before I lost my dad, I was painfully aware of being a nerdy kid and very much a loner. You'd reasonably reckon my year of mourning and the isolation that came with it would only escalate my angst and make the chances of busting out of that loner persona tougher. But if there is one thing you can say about Jewish rules for grieving, it's that they're nothing if not practical. I had done my duty, and although I was now a 13-year-old going through wildly mixed emotions, I was formally encouraged to return to the land of the living. My mom knew that I had been a good enough boy by continuing to say Kaddish 3 times a day without too much complaint, and she allowed me to circulate with friends and get back into some kind of groove. By June 1966, with school done for the year, I was still saddened beyond measure by my loss, but chomping at the bit to enter teenage society. Can you imagine how alienating that dark and solemn year had been for a 12-year-old boy who had only just developed a taste for rock and roll? In my year of mourning, no music was allowed at home, not even studying it. I did occasionally hear songs in shops or in someone's car, and the radio was always on in the background at the variety store Mom was now running alone. But when I emerged, I was still a fish out of water. I knew nearly none of the current hits, had lost touch with my favorite bands, and was woefully out of step with my classmates and my friends. I was embarrassed and desperate to catch up. That year of frustration had lit a fire under my butt. I became obsessed with buying records, mostly singles, spending everything I earned from working at the store. Roy Orbison's Oh Pretty Woman, the Yardbirds classic For Your Love, Billy Joe Royals Down in the Boondocks, and the Hollies Pay You Back with Interest off their Stop, Stop, Stop album was an early fave. Mom had started selling records meanwhile, mainly older releases she had bought at a wholesale discount, but I'd occasionally find a Motown or Pop Nugget in the bin. Since before my voice broke, I had always been drawn to Aretha Franklin and the Supremes' voices. I liked their range and would imagine them in my head, and I remember being mesmerized by the cover of Are You Experienced with its fisheye lens shot of Hendrix, Redding, and Mitchell, surrounded by a luscious gold and that fabulous psychedelic purple font. I'd go down to a friend's house at the bottom of my street to put my copy of the Beach Boys' Surfer Girl on the platter. Songs like Little Deuce Coupe and In My Room were my favorites. The latter mostly because it was to that one, in that basement, that I first slow danced and kissed a girl. My next door neighbor, Terry Kurtzer, told me he was selling his acoustic guitar. It had palm trees painted on either side of the sound hole, which were kind of goofy. But to me, the idea of owning an actual guitar was beyond cool. I begged Mom for the money to buy it, and, surprisingly, she relented, if with a furrowed brow. I wish I could recall what made me think I could learn to play, but all I know is that I really wanted it. Once I started fiddling and plucking, I was ecstatic to find that I could reproduce the first few notes of "Oh Pretty Woman." I pushed on to learn some chords and could soon play part of "For Your Love" by ear. Don't be too impressed. It basically has only 4 chords. After that, I fell into it full tilt. My first band was made up of a few neighborhood kids. We rehearsed in my friend's apartment bedroom with no amps to speak of. I played my acoustic until the mother of the bassist decided she didn't want him hanging out with the rest of us degenerates. No one wanted to take up the bass, so we drew straws, and I won. Actually, that was fine by me. It had fewer strings for a start, and I hadn't advanced very far with 6. But alas, I didn't own one. I went to my mom again and wore her down to front me money that I promised to work off in the store. For the $35 she loaned me, I bought a black solid-body, Japanese-made Kenora electric bass. I hadn't learned to do much on my acoustic but strum a few chords, and had never tried soloing, but took to this instrument quickly, obsessed with singling out the bass parts on any song I happened to hear. I started to woodshed big time, buying more records and listening over and over, determined to be the best player I could. I had to know all the bands, the coolest and most obscure songs, and connect with all the other kids who could play. Aside from music being the only thing that turned me on, it was the quickest route to acceptance by my peers, not to mention the best way to get noticed by girls in grades 7 and 8. I took it all very seriously. Actually, before I started writing this memoir, I hadn't realized just how seriously I took it or how quickly I shed my nerdy skin that year. By then, Shuddy and I were hanging out regularly and going to concerts, mostly at North York Centennial Arena or the local YMHA. We saw some terrific bands, like the Kensington Market, the Paupers, whose drummer Skip Prokop would later co-found Lighthouse, and whose bassist Denny Gerard we both held in awe. In Mandala, a blue-eyed soul group featuring the singer George Oliver and the Toronto guitarist Dominic Troiano, who had some success in Canada with a single called Opportunity. Troiano was a local legend with his twangy, funky Telecaster sound. Every city's young musicians need someone local to look up to, and in a city without many homegrown guitar heroes, he stood out by a mile as an originator and champion of funk rock guitar. His reputation spread beyond Canada when he took Joe Walsh's place in the James Gang on their underrated Straight Shooter album, and joined the Guess Who after that. My friends and I, weekend hippies, used to take the bus downtown to Yorkville Village to walk amongst the real ones. At the time, it was Toronto's answer to San Francisco's Haight-Ashbury, with a raft of clubs and coffee houses like the Riverboat, the Gaslight, the Mina Bird, the Penny Farthing, and the Upper Crust, where we'd nurse a baguette and a pot of tea for as long as we could get away with, looking groovy and hoping to catch a glimpse of one of our local heroes. The dad of one of my pals opened a restaurant in a laneway off Yorkville called the Cabbage Roll, where my pal and I got jobs washing dishes. On breaks, we'd smoke cigarettes in the back alley, trying to fit in with the hippies, a much older crowd, but we didn't care. A rock club called The Flick shared the same basement area as the restaurant, and I remember sneaking in the back door one afternoon to look at the gear that a band called The Stitch in Time had set up on a low stage. I stood there in awe of the amplification equipment that glimmered and glowed in the semi-dark, thinking, that's what I want to do, the stuff of dreams. It's true, is it not, that out of chaos sometimes comes order. It can focus the mind, for in retrospect I can see that bass had always been, You might say, in my blood and bones. Listening to the radio in the car on the way to work with my parents, it was usually the bass line and songs, often Motown ones like In the Midnight Hour and My Girl, that drove a song for me. I also used to drum on the dashboard. The tinny car radio gave you the crispness of the snare, while beating your hands on the dashboard provided the extra bottom that AM could not. So many kids did that, I'm sure, that some of the drums you'd hear on records in the 60s and 70s were a subconscious recreation of that sound. Listen to the snare sounds that Bill Seismic used to get when he produced those Eagles records, and tell me he wasn't channeling that same memory. Mom, meanwhile, was discovering herself to be a strong and highly capable businesswoman. In spite of the load she was carrying, she made the store such a going concern that she soon bought the old Canadian Tire building a few doors down, occupying half of it while renting out the other half. Gotta give it to her, she had the survivor spirit, smart and unafraid to take chances. But of course, it weighed heavily on her that I was more and more interested in rock music than in school. The irony of my unknowingly following in my father's musical footsteps cannot have been lost on her. I was burying myself in the music, mimicking the artist I loved, dreaming of nothing but being in a band and escaping the grief-stricken place that our home had become. I began listening seriously to a lot of San Francisco-based bands like the Grateful Dead and Jefferson Airplane, to Phil Lesh and especially Jack Cassidy, whose tone and inventiveness blew me away. I loved the audacious tendency he had of building his own melodies within a song, with just enough taste to temper that audacity. I like players like Paul Samwell Smith of the Yardbirds, but they sometimes seem much of a muchness to me, with their bottomy sound and their reluctance to step boldly outside of the rhythm section. Paul McCartney was the best of the bunch. His notes bounced more melodically and inventively, just as the early Motown bass players like James Jamerson had. But it wasn't until I heard Cassidy and Jack Bruce of Cream that I got a different sense of the role a bass could play, assuming a bolder, darker, more authoritative sound, commanding attention, the way a lead guitar was expected to, but in the subspace of the audio spectrum. From then on, I would always gravitate toward players like Cassidy, Bruce, John Entwistle, and Chris Squire, training my ear to hear that sound, fine-tune it, and somehow make it my own. I soon went from that bedroom band to another, along with my drummer friend Bird, the same guy who had dubbed me Geddy. Sparked by his hyperactive imagination, we gave ourselves several far-out, imitatively psychedelic band names, including the Dusty Coconuts, the Aqualine Dimension of the Mind, and the Blueberry Hyena Underwater. What do you expect? It was the 60s, man. This was during a phase of burning incense and even meditating to our records. We were suburban wannabe freaks, friends of Frank Zappa, and open to oddities like the Thugs and the Sky Saxon and the Seeds. I loved harder rock, but Fugs songs like CIA Man and Kill for Peace struck me as daring, relevant, and funny. Listen to the lyrics of Wide, Wide River, with them singing River of in three-part harmony. Those guys could surprise you with their melodic skill on songs like Morning, Morning, but how could a teenager not love a band that swears on their albums and protests the man? Think of the times when even Canadians were affected by the anti-war movement in post-Kennedy America. Draft dodgers were coming north and settling incognito all across the country, and we teens wanted to identify, letting our freak flags fly. Bird and I were such big Fug fans that in October of 1968, we went to see them in Massey Hall in Toronto. Tully Kupferberg stuck around after the show to chat with a few of us in the front row. I had stars in my eyes talking to a real rock star, if a fairly obscure and unlikely one. He gave up so much time to answer our questions that the rest of the band left without him, and Bert and I had to help him hail a cab out on the street. His generous nature and my first ever brush with fame left a lasting impression on me. For months, Shuddy, one of the first Gentile friends I made outside of my suburban Jewish ghetto, had been insisting I meet a certain blonde kid he knew, someone I had already noticed around the school, flashing his cherubic smile, his short blonde hair brushed over to one side, and wearing a white and purple paisley shirt that was all the rage at the time. Shuddy couldn't say this guy's Serbian last name, calling him Zavonovic. In fact, of all our friends, only I seemed to be able to pronounce it correctly. Alexander Zivojinovic. Alex was well liked at school, despite presenting it as a bit of a teacher's pet. You know the type, front of the class, sitting bolt upright with a grin on his face. But after we finally met in that same class, the proverbial trouble began. We'd sit together in the last row and goof off, provoking each other, cracking each other up, and obsessively sharing our love of hard, blues-based rock music when we ought to have been paying attention. The way Alex describes us is like being a little island unto ourselves, not unfriendly toward the other kids, just not as interested in hanging around with them any longer. There wasn't enough time in the day to talk about bands, players, technique, and musical styles. John Mayall and the Blues Breakers, The Who, 10 years after. During recess and lunch hour, Bert and I would recite entire Mothers of Invention songs by heart. Brown shoes don't make it. Quit school, why fake it? Amongst the other budding young players in our schoolyard, it was mainly about speed, always arguing about which guitarist or bassist was fastest up and down the neck. Jimmy Page is the fastest, man. No way, man. Alvin Lee is way, way faster. But what about Mick Taylor on Driving Sideways? His parts are amazing. Alex would come over after school to jam and spin records, and it was around that time we both became mad for Cream. Jack Bruce, Eric Clapton, and Ginger Baker set the bar for us, with fresh Cream just about glued to my turntable, as we tried to figure out Rollin' and Tumblin' and Spoonful. In the not-so-distant future, these songs would become staples of early Rush sets. We were becoming tight pals, choosing our classes together, picking the ones we thought would be easy, like, typing, and one time even signed each other's names on our exam sheets. Despite our budding bromance, meanwhile, we were still playing with other people. Alex and his friend John Rutsey had first been in a band called The Projection, and then formed a trio with a singer and bassist named Jeff Jones. It was John's older brother who suggested they call that band Rush. One day we got it into our heads to paint our instruments in a terrible imitation of Clapton's psychedelic Gibson SG. We applied little dots of some gummy fluorescent green material to the headstocks, blues and fluorescent orange all the way from the bridge to the treble pickup, and in a style not even close to that of the Fool. I managed to rather cartoon of myself. What I'd pay to see that thing again. Then one day, Alex, the self-styled supreme head of the universe, told me excitedly that he had some marijuana. Wow, I said. That's illegal, isn't it? Well, yeah, but it's cool, he reassured me. Let's go to the schoolyard and smoke up. We sat by the portables, and I smoked my first joint, the first of several thousand for me, but about a zillion for him. I got so high, I felt like I was walking on the moon. Then in a panic, I remembered that I had a rehearsal at Bird's house. Alex and I walked over together, but when we got there, it was obvious I was in no shape to play. Bird, on the other hand, was as straight as an arrow, and despite having a wild imagination, not in the least interested in smoking weed. He was livid and threatened to tell my mom. We split, but I felt too paranoid to go home. Alex said, "Don't worry. We'll go to the gas station and get a bottle of Coca-Cola. Coke brings you down, man. You'll be fine." Alex, the scientist to the rescue. Except, of course, it was useless. The best I could do was sneak into the house, straight to my room, close the door, listen to music, and wait it out. It may come as no surprise to you that at the time, Alex was often in trouble with his parents, once even running away from home and living in one of the neighborhood parks. I was very emotional, he told me. I was rebellious without a cause. Just normal teenage stuff, I guess. But I'd snap quickly like, "You can't tell me what to do. I'm out of here." I'd sleep in a park for a day and then come home and go, "Hi, what's to eat?" He'd come to my back door so I could sneak him some food, mostly blueberry buns that my mother always kept in the house for the children to snack on. When he tired of sleeping outdoors, I suggested he climb the TV antenna into my sister's room, where I'd be waiting for him. Then we slipped into my room and he crashed on the floor. Of course, we both slept in and awoke to my mother freaking out about this blonde girl asleep beneath a blanket by my bed. When she realized that it was him, she was only a little relieved. After peppering him with questions, she called his mother Melly, and that was the start of ongoing communication between the moms regarding what could be done about their wayward boys. Oi, what in the world would ever become of us? My basement band was still impatient to do a real show. We got up enough nerve to set up an audition for a battle of the bands at Fisherville Junior High. Bird's parents helped us cart our gear to the school and set up in a classroom. 2 teachers appeared and sat in front of us as we launched into our first number. We were doing all right and had almost finished when Bird, a major Who freak, decided to pull a Keith Moon. Drums and cymbals rolled and crashed around the classroom as the teachers sat aghast, and our guitarist and I stood stock still, embarrassed as. Seeing our crestfallen expressions, they told us we could still play, but only if we found a different drummer. So that's what we did. I can't recall the name of the drummer who sat in for Bird, but I distinctly recall the gig. We rented 2 small matching white Ace-tone amplifiers and set them up on either side of the drum kit on the cafeteria stage. We played something by the Blues Project with Al Cooper, and the great guitarist Mike Bloomfield slipped into Marianne Faithfull's As Tears Go By, and finished to a nice round of applause. After the show, Susie told me how proud she was, and typical of my overly emotional sister, said this with tears in her eyes. That memory still puts a smile on my face. My friendship with Bird started to fizzle out after that episode, which was too bad because he really did turn me on to a lot of different bands, which helped me reintegrate with the other kids after my year of woe. I was now connecting with new players around my hood, trying to get a fresh band together. Up until then, I had availed myself of friends' equipment at rehearsals, but had no amp of my own. At home, I figured out that if I rested the bout of my bass on the dresser, it would reverberate throughout the furniture, but wasn't loud enough to play along with the record. I then tried jerry-rigging my stereo, which worked okay, but I couldn't play my bass and a record at the same time. Finally, after scrimping and saving all year at Mom's store, I was psyched and flush enough to buy a Trainer Bassmaster amp with a twin 15-inch speaker cabinet that I had been drooling over in the window of Long and McCade, the coolest music store in the city. I used to go there just to salivate over their Fender and Rickenbacker basses and a grand array of guitars and amplifiers, but on a blizzardy day that winter, Bert and I took the bus downtown to take the plunge. Only after I had paid and then brought it out boxed and ready to go did we realize just how big and heavy the stack was. Holy! Now we'd have to lug it to the bus stop, take the bus back to the northern suburbs, and somehow get it through the blowing snow to my house. Luckily, it was so cold that the ground was solid ice, and we could slide at the final stretch in its protective cardboard. Home at last. I unboxed and plugged it in. It looked gigantic and out of place between my dresser drawers and my single bed, and as the tubes heated up, it gave off that awesome new amp smell. I couldn't turn it up as loud as I wanted, but I'll never forget how, as I tentatively played through it, that first rumble caused the furniture to throb. The red glow of the pilot light lit up my room all night long, as if a UFO had landed in my bedroom, but I was too excited to turn it off. I was ecstatic. My own Pro Model amp. The best day ever. Shortly thereafter, I was introduced to a guitarist named Peter Daniels, who asked me to join a band he was putting together to play a bar mitzvah party. Peter loved the music of the Grassroots, as did I. Midnight Confessions and Let's Live for Today were in my top 100. Also in that band was a solid drummer named Sammy Roher, who had been a friend since I was 5 on Vincy Crescent, and who I think replaced Bird after that Battle of the Bands debacle. We played some cover band staples of that period, such as Sam and Dave's Hold On I'm Comin', and Wilson Pickett's In the Midnight Hour. Not only was it a blast, but it could well have been my first paying gig. Quite recently, I was thumbing through Instagram, and a photograph I had never seen before from that very gig popped up on my feed, posted on a fan site. I couldn't believe my eyes. It's one of only 2 photos that exist of me playing in that early pre-rush period. You can see my bright and shiny new Trainer amp in the background, and a bass I owned for only a short time, a white Hagstrom HB2 with the Futurama control panel. Now this might not be big news for most people, but it is for me, as I recently published a book showcasing more than 250 of my basses, but never found a trace of that particular relic. This pic brought back a few fading sparks of memory, but I still can't remember where I got the bass or where it went. It's possible that I soon traded it in for my first Fender Precision. Anyway, I posted the photo on my own Instagram page, and hello internet, the sister of Anthony, the bar mitzvah boy, reached out to me. She very kindly sent me a more complete version, as well as another with her in front of the band while we played. Then, on the morning of September 13th, 1968, Alex rang. I assumed he wanted to borrow my Trainer, but instead he said, "Ged, we have a problem. Jeff can't make the gig tonight. Can you fill in for him?" I told him I didn't know their set, but he assured me we could load in early and rehearse until I was comfortable. So off I went. We set up in the basement of St. Theodore's of Canterbury in Willowdale, which once a week acted as a drop-in center for neighborhood teens called the Cough-In. There was no stage, just an empty room with us at one end. We didn't even have a mic stand, so we improvised, using an old floor lamp with the only mic we had taped to it. I had seen the band's drummer John Rutsey around, but I didn't really know the guy, and the rehearsal started a bit awkwardly. We didn't have time to learn more than 7 or 8 songs that day, and would have to play some of them twice to fill the time. But luckily, I already knew a few: the Jimi Hendrix Experience's Fire and Foxy Lady, a Yardbirds song, Shape of Things, a John Mayall number, and we ended with a long jam of the Cream version of Willie Dixon's classic, Spoonful, which for quite a while afterwards would be a signature song in our shows. Playing this kind of music in a trio really gave a bass player a ton of latitude to stretch out and wander all over the neck, or at least as far up the neck as my skill level would allow. So I was super happy about that. There weren't many people in attendance that night, but the organizers asked us to return the following week. We split up the night's take, around $6 each, and John suggested we celebrate by going to Panzer's Deli on Bathurst Street. They have awesome chips and gravy, he said, and thus began our first ritual, the after-show hang. Whenever we played the coffin, we'd end the night at Pantsers. The next day, Alex phoned me and asked if I'd consider joining the band on a permanent basis, which I did without hesitation. We'd go on to play the coffin regularly through to the middle of January 1969, building our very first following. Well, that's the end of Chapter 4. Let me know what you thought of Chapter 4 in the comments below. That does it for today's video, guys. I hope you enjoyed. Make sure to like, comment, and subscribe if you haven't already. I really appreciate the support. I'll see you next time. Till then, rock on.